Well, thanks everyone. We might get underway. Welcome to everyone who's here in person and also those joining us on the live stream. For this event on Do We Have the Climate Leadership We Need? That's taking place as part of the Melbourne Connect Innovation Week. I'm Jackie Peel. I'm the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures here at the University, and I'll be emceeing and moderating the panel tonight. I'd like to begin though by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we meet this evening, which here at University of Melbourne is the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. And I pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that to all Indigenous colleagues and peoples joining us either in the room or online. As an academy, we and community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students here at the university, we're privileged to work, learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. And we also recognise at the university the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, and their history of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. And we particularly acknowledge and express our profound gratitude for their enduring cultural practices and long leadership in caring for country. The organisation that I lead in the University of Melbourne, Melbourne Climate Futures, is dedicated to helping accelerate the needed transformation to a positive climate future. And we're working to bring research and evidence to these questions around how we best support ambitious policy and leadership on climate by government, by business, community and indeed the university itself. So we're partnering on this event with the City of Melbourne and Melbourne Climate Network, and grateful to those partners for their support for the event. I'd like now just to briefly introduce Yoshi Golfar from the City of Melbourne to say a few words about the Melbourne Climate Network. Thanks, Yoshi.
Thanks, Jackie. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and the Bunurong people and their elders past and present, and any elders with us in the room. I'm here from the City of Melbourne. I bring apologies from Councillor Philip Leilu, who was very much looking forward to being here this evening, but unfortunately was called away to an urgent matter. So you're with me, but I won't take very long. The City of Melbourne is very keen and very pleased to be able to sponsor this event, not just because it happens to be occurring in the City of Melbourne, although we're always happy for events to be occurring here in the city, but because an investment in climate and climate technology brings together two really strong principles for the City of Melbourne. One is the city as a net zero city and its aspirations to be world leading in everything associated with the transition to a zero carbon future. And also because the City of Melbourne is committed to growing its economy, in particular its knowledge economy and the innovation economy. And those two things come together quite nicely in a strategic project where we're trying to grow this industry sector within the city here. Our main vehicle to do that is the Melbourne Climate Network. That's an organisation that we established about 18 months ago now. It's very quickly become quite a critical player within the climate tech innovation ecosystem here in the City of Melbourne and more broadly as well. We've got now 500 members or so, and it's led by a governance group that is comprised of mainly industry people from startups to big corporations. It's really important for us that we drive outcomes through the Melbourne Climate Network. It's really important for us that we create a strong network of climate tech players in the ecosystem who are here solving finding solutions for climate problems and also growing their own initiatives in their businesses. And therefore, and that's the reason why we're really pleased to be able to support this. The Climate Network has its own website. It's climatenetwork.melbourne, I believe, or I'm pretty sure. I urge you to have a look. It's got a lot of information about all the wonderful array and diversity of solution providers that we have here in the city. There's almost 100 or just over 100 listed there, as well as details of all the events. There's basically an event at least once a month or so. I urge you to have a look. I welcome you to join up. Registration is free, and again, we're really pleased to partner with the University of Melbourne here this evening to bring you this fascinating panel. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Jackie.
Thanks very much, Yoshi. The mic's on, yes? Okay, well, now it's the time for me to introduce the panel. If you just come in, take a seat. You've missed the introductions, but not the juicy part of the panel discussions. So our topic for the session tonight is climate leadership, and whether we have the leadership we need in face of the accelerating climate crisis. And earlier today, we actually had a really important report handed down by the Climate Change Authority, which advises the federal government on climate policy. And the takeaway from that report, which was looking at pathways to net zero emissions, was that we do have all the tools and tech that we need to get there. But what we need now is a concerted, ramped up effort to deliver. And that requires political will, and it requires leadership across different sectors. And one thing that really struck me from the authorities' report was its call for the need for a zero carbon mindset to take hold across government, industry and community to actually drive that needed change. So it's really a call to action for all of us to be contributing to this action and leadership effort. So in that context, what does leadership look like, and how might we best mobilise it across Australia for our region and also for the world, especially, of course, as Australia looks to be a host potentially for the COP31 UN Climate Summit in 2026. So to help me answer those questions, we have a fantastic panel tonight who are each at the forefront of their fields, and I'll just introduce them in the order that they're sitting here. Directly on my left is Tish King. I'm going to get some of the pronunciations wrong. Don't crucify me for that, Tish. Yeah, thank you. Tish is a proud Kulagal woman, is that right? Of the Kulagal Nation, island of Masik, Zenathkes, which others might know as the Torres Strait Islands. She's a passionate oceans and climate advocate, and she's worked in many different areas across the sector, in very many civil society organisations, youth and First Nations in particular, as well as with the philanthropic sector to redistribute wealth back into First Nations communities for economic justice and sustainable development. She's now based in Naarm and wears many diverse hats and has many leadership roles. One that I particularly have come across Tish's work is with the Our Islands, Our Home campaign by Torres Strait Islander people that led to the historic Torres Strait 8 decision before the Human Rights Committee, finding Australia, the Australian government, needed to do much more to protect our First Nations communities in the Torres Strait Islands against the effects of climate change. So welcome, Tish. Next we have Kylie Porter, who's a very long-standing sustainability and ESG risk professional. I think she's got more than 20 years of experience in those areas in a variety of sustainability strategy and leadership roles. She's currently the Sunrise Group's Head of Sustainability, and in that context leads the development and execution of their sustainability strategy globally. She's formerly an executive director of the UN Global Compact Network here, the Australian branch, where she did really transform that organisation into Australia's largest corporate sustainability initiative. And I know in your profile, Kylie, it says you're driven by your ambition to enable organisations to achieve positive change by embedding sustainability principles and commitments into corporate strategy. So a great person to talk to us about what leadership requires. So welcome, Kylie. And last but not least, on the very end, we have Sam Lowe, who's the Assistant Secretary for Renewable Superpower Task Force in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. others, known by its acronym DQ in the Australian government. This is a team that works to realise Australia's renewable energy superpower opportunity and supports the delivery of the government's Future Made in Australia agenda. And Sam's worked in the Australian Public Service in a number of different roles, with responsibility for negotiating and delivering Australia's bilateral cooperation on energy and climate with a range of key international partners. So we're really pleased to have you all here and to share a diversity of perspectives. I'm going to start with you, Tish, with a broader question, which is that if our ultimate goal of climate action is to ensure a just, safe, healthy future for all communities, what do you believe that governments and business need to better consider when they're developing their sustainability and climate strategies?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for having me here. I too just want to acknowledge country as a Torres Strait Islander, a proud Kukulug woman. I am a visitor here. So kula kina lak poiban, naman koe agat, nur murusapu aimithin alak nam puka poiban, kapukubil mitag muka murumua bai. Now mabagal nu, nusanal tish, masagnu napa, Kukulug, eso. So thank you, and just extend those out to our, not only just our people, but our land, seas and skies. And so thank you very much for that question. I thought today was going to be a sunny day, and I sort of actually was reflecting on that because I've just come back from the 53rd Pacific Island Forum in the Kingdom of Tonga, which is sort of, I guess, for us another, it's a regional intergovernmental platform to influence policy and decision makers for, you know, just and equitable outcomes, and a great opportunity as this is for led by Pacific Island nations. I thought about, you know, what does it really mean? And I want to actually share that out to everyone. What does sustainability mean to you? Like, how do you define that? Because to me, that language may seem different. And so when I think about how governments and stakeholders and industries can play a role, is like essentially understanding that the way that things are working right now is not working. So how do we shake it up? What does equity and inclusivity really mean to you? Because we talk about being, having just and equitable outcomes, but who are they equitable for? And I think that brings back to, you know, we're all feeling the impacts of these changes, of climate impacts, but we're not feeling them equally. I think about intergenerational responsibility. You know, are you in positions for change? I think about how it takes a village to raise a child, but we need to actually think about it also takes a village to fail a child. And so are we that generation that will do it? Are we the generation that will hold that back so that our kids don't have a future? And for me, it's about that connection of remaining on our homeland that's at risk. It's a whole culture that is at risk. And then I think systems change. Governments, we need to, these archaic structures that have deep and rooted challenges behind them. And so we know we have champions within our agencies and have incredible leaders. How do we work together that has outcomes that are for everyone? Maybe that's a good start there.
That's an excellent start, Tish. And Sam, you have the unenviable job of coming next. But
how am I going to follow that?
With that call to action, and as we get closer to COP29 in Baku, when we go again through this international process of trying to agree how we're going to make progress and be more ambitious around climate, how's the federal government working with that range of stakeholders across industry, across the community to actually strengthen its climate action?
Thanks. Lovely question. So, I mean, I think I'll probably deal with this in a few ways. I think, like at the outset, I just note it's something we talk about quite a lot internally, and certainly with our work is just a straight up recognition that government doesn't have all the answers. And obviously, I don't think anyone in the room is going to question that. But I think just something to have in front of our minds, and certainly in our work, recognizing the value you get from those different perspectives. We do a lot of external consultation. I think we're always looking for ways to improve that. So it's a really big part of our job. I think just sort of separately dealing with the sort of two parts of your question. Obviously, COP29 this year in Baku, Azerbaijan in November, which will be super interesting. I think for Australia, I tend to think about COPs like platforms, right? They're platforms. People have discussions about really important issues, be that government stakeholders, NGOs, civil society, industry increasingly, a range of different stakeholders to come together and talk about a really important issue. As it relates to the Australian government, I think something that we've gotten better at over time and sort of continuing to work at is thinking about how can we support that as a platform, for a range of different stakeholders to come together and have views. So for the last couple of years now, we've been holding an Australian pavilion at COP, which for those who've been is a really great sort of national asset is how I think about it. It's often a bit of a home away from home for Australians in these forums, for a range of different stakeholders to come together and talk about, shared issues and shared challenges. So I think, there's that. I think beyond that, and something that we've increasingly been trying to focus on is how can we support participation of underrepresented groups in that forum. So so for this year, and last year was the first year we've done it, but running a sort of a grant program to support a range of stakeholders to come along to COP, not just government stakeholders. And I think last year we supported something like, 40 people to come, and most of those were either young people or First Nations people. So I think, it's a sort of, I think an important contribution in sort of enabling people to have, access to those important discussions. I think more generally, and I guess just a bit of a sort of maybe scene setter for the rest of the discussion, like I think there is a lot of progress happening in Australia, and I think as a public servant and sort of as a policy person, tend to think about it in terms of either like big rocks or levers. You might hear public servants talk about quite a lot, and I think in the Australian context we have a number of those in place now, and I think we are making progress. So obviously the government has a target to a goal to get to 82% renewables by 2030. Really importantly, we've got the capacity investment scheme for those who follow along, which is trying to drive that investment in renewables, and some really positive announcements just this week on sort of the progress on that and delivering some energy storage here in Victoria. Beyond that, we've got the national new vehicle efficiency standard, which will look at reducing emissions in transport as well as sort of improving consumer choice and bringing down bills for people. Beyond that, we've also of course got the safeguard mechanism reforms, which are about targeting those largest emitters. So we have and helping them sort of put them on the pathway to net zero. So we have some of those really big rocks in place. I don't think that means that it's all all done and dusted. Certainly, there's a lot of work that needs to keep happening. And I think, encouragingly, what last year's sort of emissions projection showed is that, we are within striking distance of our 2030 targets. We've got to obviously remain focused on implementation, but there is a pathway there. For my work, if I can just sort of plug my work specifically, in the most recent federal budget, I think, encouragingly, some really substantial investments in new clean energy industries as a part of the Future Made in Australia agenda. So in particular, a range of investments in renewable hydrogen, in critical minerals, which are a super important enabler of global emissions reduction, and really trying to position Australia to sort of build those new industries, not just because we think we have an opportunity, we think we do have a major opportunity, but also because, it's about us, stepping up and playing a really important role as part of that global net zero economy. So, like just a bit of a plug for my work, I guess. One thing within that, obviously, the legislation for the Future Made in Australia work is currently in Parliament. I think an important part of that is the community benefit principles, which the government's proposing to sort of embed within that, talking about, how do we engage with community and making sure that's sort of front and centre in the bill, I think is really important.
Thanks, Sam. And I think there's definitely been an acceleration in the amount of activity that everybody would acknowledge over the last few years at the federal level in terms of climate policy. Kylie, though, we do often see that industry leaders, at least in some sectors, are able to move more swiftly than government on positive climate initiatives. And what strategies do you think, if any, policymakers might be able to borrow to translate to sort of push climate adaptation and resilience forward in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I want to acknowledge what Tish said about that defining sustainability, because I think that's a really core part. And more these days you hear sustainability and ESG being interchanged, and they're actually inherently a little bit different to each other. And I think that definition of sustainability and what sustainability means for a business versus what sustainability means for a First Nations person, for a policy in a department like DQ versus another department like Department of Fisheries and Agriculture is going to be remotely different. I think one of the reasons why business tends to move a lot more swiftly than government is we probably don't operate in the same sort of behemoth silos that government does. And there is a purpose for those big, large silos, and I totally agree there's been an awful lot of progress over the last few years in terms of government policy compared to the massive climate void that we had for a really long time. But I think where business does excel in this area is we've got the ability to pivot a lot quicker and make decisions a lot more quickly. I've worked in very, very large organisations with 75,000 odd people, globally, and now at Sunrise, which is large in terms of its revenue, but we've only got 2,100 employees across 10 different countries. So our ability to effect change, to put our money where our mouth is, it requires far less steps to get something approved, requires far less pushing to get a capital expenditure approved to put solar panels, for example, on the top of a mill, or to put ground solar on a large mill. There's incremental things that we can do to make change that actually will happen with or without policy mechanisms. They are, however, made easier by policy mechanisms. A lot of the challenges that we have with our business here is that we have a lot of infrastructure in the Riverina region of New South Wales. We have a lot of mills. There are no really good connections into renewable energy systems in that part of the Riverina, right? So it is harder for us to look at how we can accelerate our commitment to be 100% renewable energy by 2030, which means that we rely on things like government mechanisms to create renewable energy certificates, for example. So I think there is a role for each and every one. I think one of the really big challenges in the policy space is the silos mean that you have policies that don't talk to each other. So if I give an example from a rice perspective, we're doing a lot of work in Australia to decarbonise rice. So effectively grow rice with a lot less water using different seed varieties. We can do that, and it looks great from a carbon perspective. It absolutely helps Australia with reaching net zero. It helps demonstrate really good agricultural practices for net zero, but it comes at the expense of biodiversity. There's already a threatened bird species called Australasian bittern that live in the rice paddies in Riverina. If I advocate to all of the growers who we have relationships with to grow rice with less water, I am inherently killing an endangered species at the same time. And because DQ is probably an exception now that it's been created because you guys all sit in one massive department, but there is still a difference between the nature repair bill and the way that we're approaching net zero. And so my biggest advice from a policy perspective is work out how to break down those silos, because that's what sustainability professionals, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and sustainability professionals who do their job well, they break down those silos within the business. They talk to the sales teams, they talk to the procurement teams. They spend every single day advocating and pushing for change, and it's a long road, but that's no different to policy. It's no different to Indigenous, reconciliation. It's no different to the work that Tish would have done in the Torres Strait Islands around that amazing, legal case. But I think where policy excels and where it should excel is, and I got this from a very intelligent Indigenous man, was thinking about things in 6 generations. And where business fails is not thinking about things in 6 generations. For us, a long-term strategy is 5 years. That's not long-term, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity for Indigenous thinking to be intermolded with policy, to be intermolded with business, so that we are developing an approach that thinks 10, 15, 20, 100 years down the track.
Thanks, Kylie. And I think we'll keep returning to Tish's point about how we define sustainability in this context and what it means to different stakeholders. But just that reference to the importance of integrating Indigenous knowledges, First Nations practices, there's often a lot of reference to working with our Pacific colleagues, working with our First Nations colleagues to realise climate action, Tish. But I wanted to ask you, are we doing enough in Australia and then in our region to support First Nations peoples to achieve sustainable climate outcomes, however we're determining that sustainability question?
How to be concise. I think I just want to start back with what Kylie and Samo shared. Agree. Where we were before the beginning of this critical decade, the government before, our current one, we were with climate deniers. And so I do want to acknowledge that there is a lot of policy coming through. Like Future Made is going to, there's so many great things that will have so many benefits that will just bring so much work back into our country. I challenge though it because while yes, we have champions and all of this, we also still need outside influence, because we also still had like a couple of weeks after that, Madeline King's beautiful future gas strategy. And to me, we think about, when we talk about that sustainability, I think about it's the vast difference between climate justice and climate action. Like 1.5 degrees could mean a fighting chance for me and my people, but 2 degrees can mean the end. So then we talk about what net zero is. What's the definition for net zero? And I think about then going back to, talking about, Kylie mentioned about the riverine and just I guess some of the resources that are there. For the Torres Strait Islands, we are very remote. And so we require urban areas and cities like Melbourne to transition quicker, because we don't even have the infrastructure to transition. So when they say just transition, that's a genuine start. But I think like what you were saying about that everyone has a role, this is where I see that through, from the budget, we saw that there is increased funding to energy projects. Is who's in the industry that has the skills and tools to do feasibility tests, to help communities like that, so that to alleviate costs that come back? Is that something that you can be a part of, work collaboratively with communities? Because then that will then help support working with stakeholders so that we can understand what our community benefits are to those renewable energies to continue to give us the self-determination. And so I preface this because the case that, for those folks that don't know, in 2019, 8 Torres Strait 8 claimants took their voices to the United Nations Human Rights Committee and accused the then Australian government, which is the Morrison government, for not reducing their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. In September 2022, the International Court found that the Australian government was in fact violating our human rights, and we have the rights to remain on our homelands and practice culture. But what it did allow was that Australia is the first developed nation, G20 nation, that has to pay loss and damage. And so I think when we're now coming back to what we're talking about these international platforms like the UNFCCC, we need to think about what have been the international steps that your own First People have done in your country. Parallel to those folks that don't know, that are all still on their journey for the UNFCCC, is that it came out of the 1992 Earth Rio Summit, where and what really influenced for the climate change conferences to come about was that a 12-year-old or 15-year-old girl, Saverne Suzuki, daughter of Dr. David Suzuki's, shared that it's going to be young people that will inherit this. And now we're up to COP29, and in the face of adversity, we still have communities like the Pacific Island nations that may come from small islands but are making big waves, and who are putting 1.5 on the agenda, who are calling out to the global north and developed nations like Australia. So when I think about, and so parallel, and when the text is written at these climate conferences, so is UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So it goes to show that climate and Indigenous people work hand in hand. And I think as we bring this back, and the responsibility we have is, what is our responsibility to our First People here, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then and how do we stand shoulder to shoulder with our Pacific Island nations, who are already leading in in these high level conversations. And so it's about, I think, the same thing here. Like, let's not blackwash or greenwash our space. Like, we're past that. This is not a PR move. Like, what does relationships look like? For me, I was raised like always making, I was told to make more food so that so no one would go without food in our community. It was always about sitting down and going slow, listening to country. I feel this wild wind weather. I don't know if you're getting something from her. Like, Sky Country is hurting, and we come from Sky Country where Bunjil is the creator here. So for us being on Naarm, it must mean something. Last week, being in the Kingdom of Tonga, we had a 6.6 earthquake on the island that also was hit by the tsunami. And so, like, our country is hurting. Our earth is hurting, and we have this sense of responsibility to really look after her and stop extracting from her, but living in peace that just weaves in all that is being and that knowledge, because we can learn the lessons from yesterday to make better choices for today that will have the outcomes for tomorrow.
Thanks so much, Tish.
Sorry, that was a word vomit. I was like, oh my God, I got so passionate then.
You mentioned there some of the importance of the international platforms, and Sam, that brings me to thinking about the likelihood that we might be hosting COP31 in Australia. The bid is still not settled, but there's a lot of hope, I think, across many sectors in the Australian community that this would come to Australia, hosted with the Pacific or in partnership with the Pacific, and provide a real platform for climate action here and a focus on the region. So what steps would you like to see taken as Australia's positioned in this sort of role to cement our place as a global climate action leader and an advocate for our neighbours in the Pacific?
Great question, and I fear my answer is going to be heavily coveted by the fact that, as you say, we are still bidding for COP31. It hasn't yet been resolved. So for those who don't know, we're currently bidding to host COP31 in 2026 in partnership with the Pacific. The other bidder, Turkey, is also still in the mix. So we're very much sort of just mindful and respectful of letting that process run its course, and I guess we're hopeful that we'll get sort of resolution to that this year, hopefully by COP29. But I think so far very, very appreciative of the support we've received from sort of other countries in our regional grouping in the UNFCCC process, but also from Pacific and Pacific leaders to sort of host COP31 in partnership. I think notwithstanding that caveat that it is still a live process, I think certainly the prospect of us hosting COP31 is exciting. I think, as I said before, COPs, each one sort of is different and has a different focus, but they are all platforms. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I think in particular, working with the partnership with the Pacific, it's a real opportunity to showcase the challenges the Pacific's facing, and I think the Pacific are incredibly successful in advocating for things that matter to them and putting that on the global agenda. So very much it's a platform for them, but also a platform for the solutions that they have and some of the the positive work that's happening there. I think just to sort of contextualise COP31 and what it might look like, because I think important to remember there's also 2 COPs between now and then. So this year we very much expect climate finance and setting the new goals for climate finance will be a focus next year. Obviously, countries will lodge their next climate targets and commitments, so that'll be the big focus. So in some ways, I think we need to let that run its course before you could say, this is what a COP31 would look like, sort of regardless of who hosts it. But I think, you can imagine it would probably include a fairly strong focus on implementation, proximity to 2030, but also following those 2 previous COPs. I think some of the things that we're thinking about, and again, obviously caveated, we haven't yet won the bid and sort of still going through that, is, holding a COP in partnership, with another region is something that hasn't been done before. So in a lot of ways, we'll have to work very closely with the Pacific and think about, how do we want to do that? And there's a whole bunch of questions you have to resolve in thinking about that. How can we use it as a platform to enable the Pacific to advocate for their interests? How can we get a good global climate outcome from that? But also, how can we get an outcome that's good for Australia as well? And obviously talked about some of my work before, but how can we use it as an opportunity to showcase some of the opportunities to invest in Australia and some of the ambitions we have as well. So I think I guess it's sort of have to win the bid first, but very much mindful that it's a big undertaking if we're successful, and so turning our minds to that and thinking about how we want to tackle that.
Thanks, Sam. And Kylie, just from a sort of industry perspective, are there opportunities that COP31 might present if it does come to Australia to better facilitate collaboration between policymakers and business?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the your theme of this week around Innovation Week is probably where the biggest opportunity is. There's a lot that happens globally, and I think there's a lot of talk about different things, and there are some industries and that are very, very good at progressing it, but Australia doesn't have the same level of tolerance of failure as what we see in some other nations. So you think about Silicon Valley in the US, it's constantly used as an example. There's a far broader acceptance that you're going to try something out as a startup and it might not work. And I think we're becoming a bit more agile in that space and thinking a lot more like that. But these big global platforms like UNFCCC or whatever it might be within a particular industry, they're a really good opportunity to leverage the learnings and the insights from other companies. I think, again, where industry sometimes fails is it's competitive, right? Like industry has been built on the very foundations of capitalism, and it fundamentally has not shifted from being shareholder primacy to being stakeholder primacy focused. And so we need to use some of these global platforms to break down those barriers to allow innovation to thrive without it being seen as stealing someone's technology, but more along the lines of what are we doing to better the planet for generations and generations to come. And so I think, from an Australian perspective, there are absolutely some things that we are ahead of, and that, to your point earlier, Sam, about the critical minerals that we have in Australia that are going to be fundamental to renewable energy. The same thing is true about some of the things that we have from an agricultural perspective here. We have very, very vast amounts of land. We have some really great examples of growers and farmers across various industries where they've implemented practices that are fundamentally under that broad categorisation of regenerative agriculture. And so I see these platforms as an opportunity to learn and to understand what other people can do and to help that innovation thrive. So for me, that would be the biggest opportunity, and then making sure that you've got the right policy levers, to use your word familiar, the right policy levers to make sure that people feel that they can be innovative, they can try things. They're not always going to work, but at least we've tried fundamentally to get there in the first place.
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
I do agree. I think it's from the experience that we saw COP26 6 at Glasgow. Oh my gosh, what number are we at? And one of the biggest eye-opening things, besides seeing carbon capture storage at our pavilion, was actually the whole city, the whole United Kingdom just transformed. And I know, like, I still feel people still talk about like the 2000 Sydney Olympics and how amazing that they organized that event. And I think that's actually like, I will agree is that our nation can organize really well, but agree that we just, need to see other people model it first or like do it. And I just think it is an opportunity, and an opportunity to not only for sectors, but to also just strengthen our communities. Like wherever community that you come from or background or shape, size, color, or faith, like it's just a great way that we can come together and just hear a different lens and perspective to those that are being impacted or what they are doing and creating just really amazing, cool things. We're the sunniest and windiest country. We have the resources here, we have the opportunities, and we just now need collective action that works collectively together.
Thanks, Tish. I think definitely sometimes
Tell I'm a
Australia,
campaigner, hey.
yeah,
We're gonna get
Australia
to
and
that.
Australians can be a bit timid to lead sometimes on the global stage, and this could be a really good opportunity to showcase that. We've got a bit of time for questions from the audience. There will be people with roving mics. Can I ask, if you're asking a question, to make sure it's a question and not an extended comment, so that we can utilise the expertise of our no, not at all, of our panellists. So if you can just phrase it succinctly and then direct it, if you'd like, to particular panellists. Thanks. Go ahead.
I suspect that the COP process is in many ways bankrupt because we've had 28 COP conferences. The last was in the United Arab Emirates, which is one of the biggest emitters in the world. And it seems to me, I guess there's a question, but it seems to me, and I'd like to hear what the panelists think, has industry, the fossil fuel industry, and other industries basically captured the COP process. And until we begin to grapple with that, I'm not sure whether we can really solve the problem. Anyway, I'll throw that out.
So are COPs really a site for leadership?
Can I share from a civil society perspective? Agree. In the face of adversity, we still come to these spaces and we need more from these high level, platforms for, if we are to reach, 1.5, we need a transformative pathway. It's defeating. I think I cry at COPs every day. It is really hard. But what I have become to understand, our domestic relations and economies is dictated by international influence. And so it's really important to be able to show up and show face. What I have also understood to learn is that these conferences aren't cheap. And so that's why we see a lot of sort of fossil fuel heavy places put their hand up, and whatever their reason, I guess that's their leadership of wanting to, see what they're trying to do. I saw there was a Climate Council report that came out at the end of last year that saw that the United Nation Arab Emirates actually emits less than Australia. And that was actually really surprising. And as an Indigenous people that has showed up is that the last 3 years, the largest delegation at a climate conference has been the fossil fuel industry. And so I definitely can see that, but I think that's privilege. It's people's privilege that if you don't show up. For some of us, it's that existential threat because we've been told by our own government that we have to relocate.
Did you want to add to that, Sam? I can see you.
Yeah, I might. I mean, I think look, I mean, the global energy transition is very significant. I think it's often referred to as, you know, the biggest change globally since the Industrial Revolution. We are talking about like hard, challenging issues. What I would say is, you know, I think in a lot of ways, you know, the Paris Agreement and the process around that, like, has been very successful. I mean, I think, you know, well over 90% of global GDP is now covered by net zero commitments. You know, you do see momentum. I think last year the IEA reported something like, you know, global investment in clean energy and sort of related, you know, demand things was, you know, nearly double that of fossil fuels. You know, so we are seeing progress. So I think, you know, by way, you know, it is achieving outcomes. I appreciate, you know, people have strong views on this, but, you know, I think it is achieving outcomes.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm not advocating for the fossil fuel industry, but I think realistically we need to look at how many things require fossil fuels to exist, right? Like the T-shirt that you're wearing has plastic on the front of it. That requires fossil fuel. We are so entrenched, deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in fossil fuels, and change is hard, right? It takes, to your point, like it takes a very, very long time. I also think, to your point, like the Paris Agreement has a massive impact. It's had a huge impact on industry. There's an expectation now that as an industry you have a science-based target set at 1.5 degrees. There are fossil fuel companies out there. I mean, I won't name them. There are ones that aren't doing it, but there are definitely fossil fuel companies out there who have what I would term a credible transition plan towards net zero. They're moving away from fossil fuels. They're investing quite heavily in renewable energy. They have the capital to do that, and they have a lot more capital than other sectors do that will enable that transition. Are they doing it fast enough? Probably not. Could they speed it up? Absolutely. They, again, have the capital to do it. But until we do transition and until we consider all the people involved in that transition and how we do that equitably, and, you know, to your point earlier, equitable means different things to different sectors and communities and people, but they do have a role to play in the meantime while we transition. And I think, you know, maybe it's about shifting our mindset around what their involvement is, and maybe some of their involvement is coming from a place of wanting to change. And these big behemoth conferences like the UNFCCC like help with understanding where that change is derived from.
Thanks. I think we've got another question over here.
Thought-provoking. I have a question for Kylie. When you said something about 6 generations ahead, so what does Sunrise use to forecast ahead? Thank you.
So in terms of 6 generations ahead, I definitely don't think that we forecast 6 generations ahead, but we, so if you take the history of the company, Sunrise started as a co-op. We've it's been a co-op in Australia for over 75 years. 75 years next year will be Sunrise's as a business, 75 years. A lot of the growers who we purchase rice from in Australia are 5th, 6th generation growers. The work that we do, and I'll just use Australia in this case as an example, but the work that we do with our growers now is we have quite sizable what we call grower services teams. They go out onto farms of growers. We don't own any land, so Sunrise has collaborative partnerships with rice growers. They buy seed off Sunrise, they sow the seed, they harvest the rice, they drop it off at our receival facilities. The work that we're doing with them now is to ensure that Australia has a rice industry in another 5 or 6 generations' time, and that's really about working with those growers to help them grow rice more sustainably. So what I was saying earlier, a lot of that is around, we invest in research and development on seed varieties that can grow and produce still like significant yields using less water in cooler conditions, so when there's frost, etc. Not that you get that many frosts anymore in sort of the sowing periods, or in cooler weather. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing is investing in that industry long term, growing rice with less water because And, any questions on water reform, I'm going to pass over to EQ. But, that's in an environment where we're going to have access to less water, whether that's because of water reform, whether that's because of climate change is irrelevant. There's going to be less water available. It's about growing under different climatic conditions so that we are still supporting the communities that we sell rice into. And predominantly, they are a lot of Australian communities.
I think we're getting close to the end of the session, so I might, with the next couple of questions, just take. Have we got more than one? If we could collect 3 questions and then throw them to the panel to see if they've got final remarks. So if you could just keep your question brief, and then we'll take the other 2.
Thanks, Warwick Peel. I've started a couple of ESG and climate ventures since 2009. Sometimes been good, some haven't. And during that whole journey, I mean, obviously a decade of it, we haven't had climate policy. But I think interestingly, around the innovation question, I've got 2 questions that feed into each other, because this is about climate leadership. I'm asking the question, if we have climate leadership in industry, our economic complexity is the lowest in the OECD in terms of Australia's economy, and that is due to lack of innovation. Obviously, we're performing very badly when it comes to emissions per capita. That continues because we've got a heavy extractives industry. But then to couple that, so that's industry and government, then we've got citizens and consumers. And my question around that is, do we have the climate leadership? We're number 2 in the world with regards to textiles waste. So speaking of plastic and this stuff, we just throw it in the bin like no tomorrow. Number 2 in the world, behind the US. We're in front of China, we're in front of India. And for every $100 we spend as consumers in this country on food, $30 of it goes in the waste. So my question is, who are the leaders in industry and government, and who are we, or not, as leaders, as consumers and citizens in this country?
Yep, thank you. Hello, Matthew, Sustainability Consultant. I just have a general question, and you might say, mate, you missed 1 hour of the talk, but who should be in front and leading climate initiative? Should it be the government? Should it be businesses? Or should it be civil society? Who is the most and who has the best legitimacy and the best resources to do so? As businesses have resources, but they might not have democratic legitimacy. Government have few and constrained resources, and civil society has few understanding of the matter. So, yeah.
Great. Let's say we take a time capsule is 2,300, like 6th generation, and can you describe the quality of the leaders that have led us through to that point?
Okay, that's a great collection of questions to have. I think in summary, it's about the roles of different parts across the society to lead, including consumers and individuals. And also that question of looking forward, if you are imagining what sorts of leaders we need to build for the future, what do they look like? And just thinking in a university context, that's a question that I'm really interested in as well. So perhaps if you want to each have your thoughts, we'll start with you, Sam.
I can start. I might start, Warwick, with your question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different things I'd probably point to. I think, leadership can take, a lot of different forms. I think when it comes to Australia, I think there are some things that we are genuinely leaders in, certainly looking at households and like the role they've played in deploying solar, like that is genuinely world leading and has been quite remarkable. That has been a part of result of households and individuals making decisions, but also result of government policy at the federal level, but also state and territory level. I think that's a really good example, and also leadership, including in Australia, on the innovation front. I mean, solar technology, Australia's played a really, really important part in the innovation that's led to that, and the modern solar panel, in a lot of ways, is based on Australian innovation. So I think as a good example, leadership can take lots of different forms. Certainly, innovation is something that's really important. I think something that we have to sort of continue looking at. Again, another plug, but last federal budget, some really significant investments through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency for innovation. So a new innovation fund, 1.7 billion there, as well as general funding. I think in recognition to your point that innovation is really important and can play an important role in not just sort of tackling climate, but also there's other issues of economic complexity and unlocking those opportunities. I'll stop there.
I think, Matthew, I think it was to your question, I don't think it should be up to one particular group or individual, right? Like, we've all got roles to play. We've all got important roles to play. And, to Warwick's questions, consumers have just as much ability to affect change. And there's massive structural change that has to happen in terms of getting consumers to change. So, being less consumerist in their consumerism, there's lots of things like that require different mechanisms, different levers, different motivations to prompt that change. And that's going to require work from across all three sectors and not necessarily one leading over the other. It's a pathway to partnerships and collaboration. And to be honest, they're hard, right? Partnerships are hard work. But that's what's going to be required to get us to 300, six generations ahead. The types of leaders who we are going to see are the leaders who have the ability to break down those barriers between those sectors. They're the leaders who are willing to, for want of a much better way of explaining it, risk it all to have a partnership, to work in partnership, to make those compromises where compromises need to be made, but ultimately push us forward. And some of those already exist. Like Warwick, there are plenty of examples of initiatives out there that are trying really hard to shift and make change. There's food waste ones that are coming out, everywhere. There's fashion ones that are coming out. It's more, I think, what people don't know. And the people who are going to be leaders are the ones who will highlight that what you don't know becomes far more in the modern day periphery. But again, I think not one particular leader, not one particular style, but people who are really good at partnerships.
Tish, you've got the final word.
Thank you, everyone. Agree. Sorry, I just had to think about all of that. I think just to add to, as I was just taking some notes. Okay, starting with you, Warwick, I really hate the carbon calculator. The Shell, I'm pretty sure it was Shell, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone out there, the carbon calculator put that onus on the individual, not the system. And so, but what it did do was open up that it's not just in the environmental space that needs to shift, that all industries and sectors need to. And so outside of this, zero waste and food systems and structures are a really big part of that, because it's that connection to land. It's like, how do we keep everything in this circular economy, or minimize as much as we can because of its carbon footprint. So sort of like Kylie said, there's like amazing initiatives that are out there, like my friend, like our friend Sam Elsham, that's doing sea forest, that's growing Asparagopsis seaweed to feed, cattle to reduce methane emissions. We've got like amazing zero waste, like sort of food, not food, fashion spaces like Social Outfit and Impacts. Like also I love like Intercarry down in Collingwood, teaching people how to sew and build up your skills so that you feel more comfortable about mending your own clothes. Like there's some really cool people at a local level. I guess it is just sort of, finding out where everyone is. I'm a stage 8 crazy person stalker, so I'm creepy on the gram. So that's how I find people. Soz. Okay, leadership. Agree. it's not one person. We need government, we need corporations, but we need civil society put that pressure on. I guess it's about, you know, we do reflect the type of leadership you are and the actions that you take. Change is not passive, it's active. So it's about what are we doing today for a better tomorrow. And so I think that's about, you know, who are the people you're surrounding yourself with? What's the type of work that you're in? What's the, you know, what's the type of values and goals that you have? And making it more holistic, because it comes at a personal level as well. And then the scope of like 2,300, I think of like when you talk about 6 generations, I think of the Iroquois people, about we have the 7 generation theory, 3 generations in front, 3 generations behind. And I think about the footprints that have gone before me and their contributions to native title, to protecting our oceans, and for our people even being considered people in this country, from flora to fauna to being accepted as just humans. And I think about the ancestor that I want to be and what I will leave for the future generations, and I hope that they can remain on their homeland and that we're living in a thriving world where everyone works together with renewable energy and flowers and rainbows and unicorns floating everywhere. Wow. But that's, I guess, to add on top of that.
Thanks. So leadership is being active about change, not passive in the face of change, about collaboration, about partnerships, and ultimately it takes all of us working together, because there's not just one solution. So can you join with me in thanking our wonderful panel of climate leaders? And thank you to each of you for your current climate leadership and courage and active participation in this space. We do have some refreshments. They're kind of located a little, it's not immediately obvious to find where they are. So you go out the doors, turn right, and then you'll find them. There's people to direct you if you'd like to join us. And I think some of our panellists will be able to stay for a little bit longer. Invite you all to take part. So thanks very much for coming along, and to our online audience too. Thank you.